The forest had always been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the whispers of the trees and the endless stretch of trails. When I heard about Pine Hollow, a sprawling wilderness near a sleepy Midwest town, I couldn't resist. A couple of days out there, alone with my thoughts, sounded like exactly what I needed. I arrived in town late in the afternoon. The sun was low, bathing the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts in warm light. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been left behind by time. People stared as I parked my truck and stepped out, but I tried not to let it bother me. Small towns have a way of making strangers feel like outsiders. At a tiny diner, I grabbed a booth and ordered a coffee. The place was quiet except for two men at the counter, their voices low but urgent. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their conversation carried. Another one gone, one of them said, his fingers tapping nervously on his cup. Last seen out by Pine Hollow. People never listen, the other replied. That place isn't right. I couldn't help myself. What's wrong with Pine Hollow? I asked, trying to sound casual. The men exchanged glances, their expressions tight. Before they could answer, an old man at a corner table gestured me over. His hand, knotted with age, beckoned insistently. Against my better judgment, I went. You planning to head into that forest? He asked, his voice gravelly but clear. I nodded. Just for a couple of days. Something wrong with that? His gaze hardened. The dear woman, he said simply. That's what's wrong. The what? He leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of tobacco. She's a spirit, a shapeshifter, appears as a deer, sometimes as a woman, beautiful beyond belief. But she's neither. She's a predator, and if you cross her, you won't make it out of those woods alive. I forced a laugh. Sounds like a campfire story. Laugh all you want, he said, his voice cold. Just don't ignore the signs. If you see her, run. By the time I left the diner, the sun was setting, painting the horizon in fiery reds and golds. I couldn't shake the old man's words, but I told myself it was just small-town superstition. I wasn't going to let a ghost story ruin my trip. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived, the forest bathed in the soft glow of dusk. As I shouldered my pack and stepped into the woods, the familiar thrill of adventure took over. The old man's warning felt distant, almost laughable. Still, as I walked deeper into the forest, a phrase echoed in my mind. She's neither. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the world outside seemed to fade away. Pine Hollow was everything I'd hoped for. Towering pines that stretched endlessly into the sky, trails blanketed in soft moss, and a kind of silence that was both serene and unnerving. I found a small clearing to set up camp just before nightfall. It was perfect, sheltered by dense trees, with enough open space to build a fire. As I pitched my tent and gathered wood, the last rays of sunlight vanished, leaving the world cloaked in shadows. By the time I had a fire going, the darkness felt absolute. The only sounds were the crackle of flames and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a while, I let myself relax, leaning back against my pack and staring at the stars. There's something humbling about being out here, surrounded by nothing but nature. Then I heard it, a faint sound just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but no, it was rhythmic. Tap, 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 like footsteps or hoofbeats. I sat up, every nerve on edge, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. My flashlight was within reach, and I grabbed it, my hand trembling as I swept the beam across the clearing. Trees, bushes, shadows, nothing unusual. Probably just an animal, I muttered under my breath, trying to steady my nerves. Deer were common in forests like this, and they could sound deceptively heavy when moving through underbrush. But then the sound changed. It wasn't just movement, it was deliberate, like someone or something pacing just out of sight. My heart pounded as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just the crackling of the fire and that persistent tapping. I stood, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, and took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the clearing. My breath hung in the air, the temperature seeming to drop with every passing second. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking slightly. Again, no response. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating. It pressed down on me, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Just a flash of movement between the trees. Something tall and lean, moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. I swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam revealed nothing but empty forest. Shaken, I retreated to the fire, telling myself it was my imagination. Maybe the old man's story had gotten under my skin more than I realized. I sat as close to the flames as I could without burning myself, hoping their light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Eventually, the noises stopped, and the oppressive feeling lifted. But I couldn't shake the unease. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there in the dark, every sound amplified by my heightened senses. Sleep came in fits, my dreams haunted by strange hoofbeats and a soft, mocking laugh. When I finally woke, pale morning light filtered through the fabric of the tent. I unzipped it and stepped outside, relieved to see the clearing bathed in sunlight. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only cold ashes. But there, just beyond the ring of stones where the fire had been, was a single hoofprint pressed deep into the earth. It was too large for a deer, too deliberate. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, dread pooling in my gut. I wasn't alone last night. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the hoofprint. The edges were sharp, the imprint deep, as if whatever had made it weighed far more than any normal deer. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew better. Despite my growing unease, I decided to stick to my plan. Packing up my camp, I set out to explore further into the forest. The old man's story replayed in my mind with every step, his words now feeling less like superstition and more like a warning I had foolishly ignored. By midday, the trees seemed closer together, their shadows longer and darker despite the sun hanging high above. The trail twisted and turned, disorienting me. I had a map, but even that seemed useless in the labyrinth of Pine Hollow. That's when I saw her. At first, she was just a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still among the trees. She wore a flowing dress that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight. Her hair was dark and fell in waves over her shoulders, and even from afar, I could see her eyes. They were luminous, almost too bright, like twin stars piercing the gloom. I froze, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. But there was something about her, something magnetic, that kept me rooted in place. She began to move toward me, her steps impossibly graceful, almost as if she were gliding. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic. It was a sound that didn't belong in this wild, untamed place. I'm fine," I stammered, my throat dry. "Just hiking." She tilted her head, a smile playing on her lips. "You shouldn't be here. These woods aren't safe." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "You'll see." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. It was as if the forest swallowed her whole. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where she had been. Finally, I forced myself to move, my legs heavy as I trudged back toward the clearing where I'd set up camp the night before. But the forest felt different now, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every sound seemed amplified. I told myself I'd leave the forest at first light. Whatever was out here, it wasn't something I wanted to face alone. But as I reached the clearing, I realized leaving might not be so simple. The hoofprints were back. This time, they weren't just a single mark. They formed a trail, circling the campsite in deliberate, menacing loops. My heart pounded as I traced their path, trying to make sense of it. And then I heard it, the laugh, soft, feminine, and chillingly familiar. It came from somewhere deep in the trees, echoing through the stillness. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and saw something moving between the shadows. This time, it wasn't her. It was a deer, or at least, that's what it looked like at first. But as it stepped into the dim light of the clearing, I realized it wasn't right. Its legs were too long, its eyes too human, and its movements too calculated. It stood there, watching me, its gaze unblinking. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I sprinted through the forest, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. The sound of hoofbeats followed me, relentless and growing louder with every step. I didn't stop until I stumbled onto the trailhead, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The forest was silent now, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. As I looked back, I thought I saw her again, standing just beyond the tree-line. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, and her smile was the last thing I saw before I turned and fled to my truck. I didn't stop driving until the forest was far behind me. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white, and every shadow on the side of the road made my heart skip a beat. The old man's warning replayed in my mind, now stripped of any doubt. She's neither. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun was beginning to rise. I pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel and stumbled inside, desperate for somewhere safe. The clerk gave me a strange look as I asked for a room, but I didn't care. I just needed a door I could lock and walls to separate me from whatever was out there. Once inside, I bolted the door and closed the curtains, plunging the room into darkness. My body felt heavy, every muscle aching from the night's terror. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in my mind, a phantom rhythm I couldn't shake. I replayed everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was she a spirit, a creature, or was my mind unraveling, the isolation and fear warping reality into something unrecognizable? Sleep eventually claimed me, though it was far from restful. My dreams were a blur of twisted images. Her face, beautiful and haunting, her smile morphing into something monstrous. The deer's eyes, human and unblinking, stared at me from the darkness. And always, the sound of hoofbeats, steady and inescapable. I woke to a pounding at the door. My heart leaped into my throat as I bolted upright. For a moment, I was certain it was her, that somehow she had followed me. But the voice that came through the door wasn't hers. It was gruff and impatient. "Sheriff's Department, open up." I hesitated, my hands trembling as I unbolted the door. A man in a faded uniform stood there, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You the one who came out of Pine Hollow last night?" he asked. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, why?" He stepped inside, glancing around the room. "We've had a lot of trouble out there lately. People going missing. Locals warned you, didn't they?" "They did," I admitted, "but I didn't think." He cut me off with a grim look. "You're lucky you made it out. Not everyone does." I wanted to tell him everything, the woman, the hoofprints, the thing that had chased me, but I stopped myself. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? "What's out there?" I asked instead. The sheriff hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's a spirit, others a curse. But it's old, older than this town, older than anything we can name. And whatever it is, it doesn't take kindly to strangers." He handed me a card with a number scrawled on it. "If you see or remember anything unusual, call me." I nodded, pocketing the card as he left. But I knew I wouldn't call. What could he do against something like her? That night, I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and Pine Hollow. But as I drove through the endless stretch of highway, the sense of unease never left. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a flash of movement, a shadow that shouldn't be there. And when I stopped for gas, I noticed hoofprints in the dirt near my truck, leading away into the darkness. She wasn't done with me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, Selene stopped abruptly. Her laughter, once soft and alluring, shifted into a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel the forest tightening around me, its oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her heavy breaths. I turned, heart pounding, but there was no sign of her. The trees seemed to be closing in, their twisted branches reaching out as if the forest itself was alive. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but Selene had vanished. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there, only the endless expanse of trees, stretching into the darkness. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, eerie whinny. The sound made my stomach churn, as though something monstrous lurked just out of sight. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed hoofprints carved into the soft earth. They were everywhere, leading deeper into the forest. I couldn't look away, yet I knew I shouldn't follow them. My instinct screamed at me to run, but something held me in place. The air grew colder, and the oppressive stillness of the woods became deafening. I tried to take a step, but it felt as if the ground beneath my feet shifted, folding inwards. No path seemed clear, no direction offered an escape. Every turn I made brought more trees, more shadows, and more silence. Her voice cut through the stillness, soft, mocking. "Run if you can, Ethan," Selene whispered, her tone dripping with malice. "But you'll never leave this forest." Terror surged through me. I didn't know if she was behind me or somewhere ahead, but her voice was everywhere, surrounding me like a nightmare. I pushed forward, but the forest twisted against me. Trees fell in my path, their branches snatching at my clothes. Every direction I chose seemed to lead to a dead end. The sound of her laughter echoed through the trees, distant yet unmistakable, as if the very forest itself was mocking my struggle. I could feel her watching, waiting, as if toying with me. The once beautiful, serene woods had become a maze of despair, every path an illusion of freedom. Suddenly, I stumbled and fell, my hands hitting the cold, hard ground. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, as though she was right behind me now. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs trembling as I tried to push myself to my feet. But there was no escape. The shadow of something monstrous loomed over me, its presence suffocating. I could feel the weight of Selene's gaze. Even though I couldn't see her, the darkness closed in, and her voice, now a twisted, animalistic growl, filled my ears. In that moment, I realized there was no escape, no turning back, no hope. The screen faded to black, leaving me to wonder if I'd ever emerge from that forest, or if the dear woman had claimed me forever.